This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. Today's sponsor is A2 Hosting. I've been using A2 Hosting solid state hosting solutions for our website at geekleader.com for many years now, and absolutely love their support, their service, and all the features that you get. You get access to cPanel. You get all of the things that you can imagine for a great WordPress experience, including their A2 optimized WordPress, which does extra security checks, extra lockdown. You can lock down your editor file so you can't edit anything inside there. You get alerts whenever there are file changes that are done. You can also do automatic updates, backups, and more with A2 Hosting. So highly recommend it. Go to geekleader.com/A2 to get more information and to sign up for their solid state turbocharged speed hosting today. Again, that's at geekleader.com/A2. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on this show, I am honored to have Swizec Teller, and he is a software engineer, author, indie hacker, and we're here just to talk about how leaders and engineers and software developers today can grow their career the right way, get into becoming a senior engineer, becoming a team lead, becoming more than what they are right now, and doing it the right way, not the wrong way, not rushing into things, not taking shortcuts, but just growing the correct way. And with all that being said, Swizec, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about how you got to where you are in your career and kind of what it is you're doing today.
Right. So although I'm relatively young, I've been doing this for a surprisingly long time. I was just thinking the other day, it's been 20 years since I started working on the web. Just
wow,
kind of mind blowing, but we've seen a lot of things change. But I kind of started my career in Europe doing a bunch of internships over the summer. Then in college, I tried to launch a startup because that was a really big thing. And this was like 2008, 2009. Had lots of fun, didn't really go anywhere, but it got me into launching a freelancing career, working for American startups, which then also led to me dropping out of college because I was too busy making bank. And I was like, why am I wasting time on college if I'm already doing what the college is supposed to be teaching me and doing it way better? And then from that, I realized what I really want to do is go to Silicon Valley and kind of make it in San Francisco. I don't know about the making it part, but I've been here now 7 years. It's actually 7 years this month that I moved permanently to SF. And just the way things are done here and the way things work in these really hyper growth, fast scaling organizations that we have here, like, changed a lot of how I think about software engineering and approaching like what it is that software engineers are supposed to be doing. So I've now kind of been trying to turn a lot of those tacit lessons and that tacit knowledge back into words so I can share it with others.
So what makes you want to share it to others, not just like keep it all for yourself?
Mm-hmm. I think the main thing is just thinking back to how I thought about engineering back. Like, the main thing really is I'm trying to think. So I guess the fundamental reason is I want to help others. I want to I have a strong sense of I figured out how to get here, mostly to an extent. There's people who have done it way better, and there's people who have just had a better head start. That's always the case. But I want to help those people who are coming behind me and who don't know these things so that they can advance faster. Because in part, I think that's really good for the industry as a whole. I'm not like one of those engineers who now looks at, this is something that always bugs me when you see people, they've had their career for 10 years and they have a cushy big tech job and they're saying, oh, no, young people, do not burn yourself out, do not work hard. It's like, really? Are you really just telling them not to work hard because you're afraid that they're snipping at your heels, or are you trying to share some lessons? And I never want to come off as not encouraging people to keep snipping at my heels, because that makes me better, that makes the whole industry better. And I just think it's good for the industry that we have so much young talent coming up, and the faster they can advance, the faster they can get to being really good, solid engineers, solving the right kinds of problems, the better that is for everyone. But what that also does is there's this concept of I think it was Gregory something. He writes a really good newsletter, and he once wrote about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 companies, where tier 3 companies are the Ubers and Facebooks and such of the world, where it's not so much they make a lot of money, but they want to be a top company. So they really spoil engineers, but they also really look for the best talent. And like the difference in compensation you can have between a local company somewhere in, let's say, Italy, and a company that's really global and trying to be a tier 3 company is immense. Like, I have a friend slash former freelancer who I helped, and I was encouraging him, hey, you should really stop working for your local company. And he managed to change from making, like, I think it was around $20,000 a year to making $120,000 a year overnight by just changing jobs. That is a huge, like, that has a huge impact on this guy's lifestyle, on everything, really. So that's kind of the things that I'm interested in helping with. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And you know, what is it that you see that I guess engineers are kind of doing wrong? Because I've seen exactly what you're saying right there. Or I've had a friend that took a job somewhere and he thought that, you know, he had to be loyal to this company because they offered him his first job, you know, in software development. And, you know, it was one of those companies that traditionally, you know, gave the 3% raises every year, cost of living. And he had been there for, you know, roughly 5 years. And, you know, people that were going to other companies were making significantly higher because the demand for, you know, good software engineers was growing much faster than the 3% raises he was getting there. But what is it that you're seeing that engineers are doing wrong and you do differently?
So I think what most of us do differently, and I haven't figured out yet if this is just because of my European background or if it's all, I call them non-Silicon Valley companies. They don't have to be physically in Silicon Valley to be Silicon Valley company. Like Spotify is definitely a Silicon Valley style company, as is Amazon and Microsoft, even though they're in Seattle, right? But what I see a lot of people do is they get really focused on the technical stuff. And I remember having conversations with my friends when we were all freelancing for the US, and we were working for an American startup. And the startup had also a couple of San Francisco engineers that were being paid probably double what we were making. And we just kept looking at them and we're like, these people's code is shit. Everything they do is kind of terrible and like almost half-assed compared to what we considered solid engineering and good engineering practices. Everything was just super fast and kind of thrown over the wall and weird. I was like, what is this guy doing that's making them get paid twice as much as we are, even though their code is objectively worse? And that was kind of my first insight into this, that it's not really so much about the code that you write. It's more about who you write that code for and whether you're achieving business objectives. And like an example I like to use, or the transformation I went through in the last couple of years, is that I went from somebody who's really good at hammering to being someone who uses hammers to solve problems. And that's the kind of people that companies actually want. That's the engineer who's like, oh my God, we want to hire that person. Because that's really what companies care about, right? They don't care about the code itself. They don't care about the craft of coding. They don't care about almost any of the things that traditionally engineers are super interested in. What they care about is, how can we get the most money at the cheapest cost with a good enough product where good enough is basically defined by, it doesn't make people say, I'm quitting this, I'm canceling my subscription because of bugs.
Yeah.
As long as
So
people aren't, yeah, go on.
I was gonna say, I think that's where like good leadership comes in, because if you have those excellent engineers that, they're more interested in writing beautiful code than solving the problem. But you have a good leader that can direct that beautiful code into solving a problem, or a good senior engineer that realizes like, yeah, I've got some, really awesome developers on my team that can just do amazing things with software. And I can speak from experience. When I was managing a web and mobile development team, it was my first management job, and I ended up hiring this guy. He was real young. He dropped out of high school, got his GED, went to college for like a year, and then a tech school, and dropped out of that. And one of the professors at that tech school I was friends with called me and said, "Hey, if you have any openings, you need to hire this kid." And I'm like, "What?" And it's like, yeah, you need to hire him. He just dropped out. He doesn't have a job, but his code is amazing. So I had an opening. So I reached out to him and I hired him, and his code was incredible. Like he could write software faster and better and less lines of code than anybody I've ever seen. But he didn't ever solve the problems. We had to, very specifically say, this is what we want. And then sometimes he would be like, yeah, but that's crap. Like, yeah, it's crap, but that's what the business wants. They want crap every now and then.
Yeah.
So you have to have that good leader that can kind of point them in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, I have so many stories of like business asking for something like, but why? Like we had a really interesting case recently where the business specifically asked, we want this to be possible and impossible at the same time. It's like, what? You want users to be able to do something, but also not to be able to do it. And, we just had to figure it out. It doesn't make any sense, but in the business world, it does. So what I think you can do there as a leader, and I have some experience with this, where it's like you have to, I don't know, I think in a lot of ways it's a growth opportunity especially for those kinds of engineers, to learn more about why the business needs what it needs. But as a leader, the way I think you can help them get there is by doing a lot of the annoying stuff for them. Where like what I try to do when I'm leading a story is to kind of get everyone together to design the solution to the story, and to actually talk about specifically how are we solving this problem rather than what the implementation is. And then when everyone is involved in the actual solution part, when everyone's involved in the domain modeling, the figuring out how we're going to fit this into the existing system, talking about how this is going to evolve over time into the next iteration of the system. When people the more you involve people in that, the more they get used to thinking about it that way, and the less they get interested in, at least in my experience, the less they get interested in the minutiae details of the code itself, just because you're involving them at that higher abstraction layer. And what I really like to do is get the code out as late as possible. So it's more, let's write a document, let's draw some pictures, let's work on the level of lines and diagrams and squares, because that kind of forces you to not think about the details of the code. And then you can be like, okay, now because you're really good at writing really solid code, here's a tiny part of the problem. This is how it spelunks up, or how it levels up into the overall solution. Go implement this tiny part. And then the super nerds go off and they do their amazing work, and it's really great. But you're kind of forcing them to have that global perspective by just involving them in the conversation.
Yeah, we recently we're kind of, I guess all the companies are using these buzzwords like digital transformation and things like that. And where we're at, we're kind of going through that with our developers right now, and we've started bringing them more into business meetings than we did before. So like instead of having just one product, this is a small team of developers, and they've had one product owner that kind of came in and just did this normal scrum ceremonies and things like that. But now we're kind of bringing in other people from the business to kind of teach their areas and their parts, even though it's not really relevant to the code that they're writing right now. It just gives them a more broader understanding.
Mhm.
and you can kind of see like light bulbs popping up, like, oh, now I know why we did this. Now I know why we did this. And it's like, oh, we should have done this like years ago. I don't know why we're so
Mhm.
slow about getting this. But yeah, I think that's great that, slowing down the code writing to get a better perspective is
Mhm.
super important.
Yeah, and what I also really appreciate from product owners is when they aren't just drip feeding us their ideas, but it's more like, here's what we want to achieve over this long time span. Like here, this initiative that's going to increase the metrics by this much. And it's like, they specifically tell us, these are the business metrics that we're trying to improve with this project. And here's how we're going to know whether we actually improve them. Here's how users are using what you're building. And I think that's one of the really, that's one of my favorite insights is to, if possible, especially for internal users, just go shadow them. Go look at how the users are using your software. And when you have a whole team of engineers watching somebody use their software, they will usually start having those ideas of like, oh my God, we made this. It made so much sense in the code, but it's really slowing down the actual users. Or, oh my God, the users aren't actually thinking about this in the same way that we are. They have completely different vocabulary about it. They think about it in a different way. We should change our software to be more like the way the users think about it, because after all, we're building this to solve user problems. We're not building this for the sake of building it. It's like it's like that nobody wakes up in the morning to say, oh, I'm going to use Microsoft Word today. No, they wake up in the morning, have their coffee, and they think, oh, I'm going to write this book today, or oh, I'm going to write this business proposal so that I can raise $1 million. The Word, Microsoft Word itself, is just a tool. They don't care about the tool. It's the same as when you want to hammer a nail. You don't really care about how hammers are made or about the perfect hammer. You just want something hard to hit the nail with.
Right.
Where was it
Yeah,
going?
no, no, I think I see that, and I agree 100%. I think that's exactly right. We're not always thinking about the greater perspective of what's going on. And I remember when I was first learning how to write code and build stuff, I had a boss he was awesome about giving me things in a way that I understood it. And he told me, what you're doing with your code is you're building beautiful doors. You're building a lot of beautiful doors for users to come right in. But the problem is the users don't know their doors. They're coming in through the windows because that's how they're used to getting into the software. And you got to take a step back and say, how can I make the windows more accessible as well? And do things that the users will see. Because users, I remember he gave Word as an example. He said, how do you open Word? I said, I go to, this is back when you had the start button. I go to start, click on, Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word. Okay, you open up Word. He's like, that's great. You know how a lot of other people open up Word? They find their last used Word document and double click on that.
Yep.
So you got to realize the different paths.
Exactly. Yeah, and the other thing that comes from that is I think just being exposed to those bigger problems kind of makes you very quickly start thinking of code as a tool. And I find that once engineers stop thinking of code as the goal and start thinking of code as the tool, that solves, well, maybe not solves, but it makes a lot of other issues on engineering teams easier as well. It's like it makes code review a lot easier because people feel less emotionally attached to the code because they're emotionally attached to solving the problem. It makes it easier to discuss different solutions, makes it easier to give feedback. It's much easier to say, hey, this code isn't going to solve the problem, when somebody cares about solving the problem more than they care about how beautiful their specific loop, like way of iterating over an array is, or God forbid, back when we used to debate about how to specifically format an if sentence or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So let's say I'm a junior engineer and I took your advice and I just left the first company I went with, and because I've been there for a while and I wasn't growing anymore, found another opportunity where I was able to double my salary, but also grow a lot, get into where I can learn more technologies and expand myself. What's the next step that I should be looking for?
I think what the next step is kind of depends on where you want to go. From what I've seen, there's a couple of different directions that you can grow as a senior engineer. And one of the most important things in my experience is to observe when you're starting to stagnate and to jump before it starts going downhill or before you're super stagnating, because it's kind of demoralizing when you're stagnating or when nothing is improving. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of engineers do is that, or maybe not a mistake, but one of the paths that a lot of engineers take is to just learn more technologies and like go from being super senior in something to jumping into a completely different stack or completely different tool set, and essentially become a newbie again, because it's fun to learn new stuff, right? It's super fun to pick up a new technology and learn it. And people usually do that for a long time, and it's great, but I think it ultimately limits your career growth. Whereas another approach that I prefer is to go into bigger and better problems. So focusing less on the tech stack or the skills that you have, and focusing more on what kind of problems you can solve and who for. So like an example I like to use is, let's say you are really good at, I don't know, writing distributed systems, and most of us never, or maybe that's too big of an example, but let's stick to distributed systems. You're really good at distributed systems. You've been able to work at relatively large companies, and you're really good at keeping distributed systems alive and kicking. You could jump from one way of writing distributed systems to another and just keep learning new technologies, or you could go work for the sort of company where if there's software goes down on Black Friday, they start losing $5 million per minute. That kind of company will pay a lot for your skills. And would you rather jump into another company that can't afford that, or that doesn't have expensive problems like that? Or is it better to find bigger problems where for a company that can pay a lot? And that's where a lot of the perspective comes from. This kind of more of a consulting perspective, where it doesn't matter so much what it is exactly that you do. It's more about who you're doing it for and how valuable it is to them. So that's one way of growing your career, is to find companies that can use your skills in bigger, better ways. Another approach is to kind of, or maybe this isn't so much another approach, but I always try to work in a way that makes me redundant, or like I'm always trying to code myself out of a job, because that opens you up to other jobs, more interesting jobs, lets you climb up the abstraction layers. And like the kind of stuff I'm doing now is getting really interesting, where instead of focusing on how to best write a JavaScript function, I'm now working on things like how to lead a technical initiative that spans an entire quarter and goes across multiple teams and levels up to something where the CEO at a wide company meeting says, this is the single most important thing to the entire company. And like, it's a completely different way of thinking, really. It's like suddenly how to write a for loop in JavaScript or in whatever just doesn't feel interesting anymore. It's like such a low implementation detail that, I don't know, it's kind of hard to put into words, but just like bigger, better problems where you get to be the tech lead of a large initiative that's important to the company that spans multiple teams, and how to make everyone focused, going in the right direction, how to bushwhack in front of them to make sure that they can then go in and write the code as beautifully as they want. That's an interesting challenge. And then you also have the more entrepreneurial approaches where people are like, well, I've reached this point in my career. I'm really interested in being an IC, but I don't care about like companies and such anymore. So they go into freelancing or consulting, where you get a bit more freedom. It's a trade-off between freedom and having different kind of problems to work on, because you have to do business stuff as well, or people become founders. But management is also another path, but I feel like with management, it's like you're not really doing engineering anymore. And to me personally, that's less interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a trade-off there. No matter which way you go. Like you said, if you go into
Mm-hmm.
the IC world, you're gonna, you're gonna trade off some of the security maybe that you had before,
Mm-hmm.
and that. But and then going into management, you're right. It's not engineering at all. It's a
Yeah.
very different skill set, and that's
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of people have kind of, I felt like they were kind of getting forced into management. I know,
Mm-hmm.
at least even in my perspective, it was one of those things like, hey, we're promoting you, and now you're a manager. Although I probably could have said no, I'm not interested. Actually, I know I could have said that. They dangled
Mm-hmm.
that salary out there of how
Yeah.
much more money you're going to get, and it's like, well, I have to accept this. I have a family. I have kids.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of get trapped in that thing. So one of the things that I've done is, when I first moved in management, I kind of had what I call my fun day Friday. So Friday I was going
Mm-hmm.
to write code. I'm not going to manage people. I'm
Oh,
going to do
that's
something
nice.
fun. I'm going to write code on Friday. So
Mm-hmm.
I do no meetings on Friday except for just writing code. And it's my fun day Friday to keep me kind of in the loop. But then I also
Mm-hmm.
kind of shifted and I started teaching. So I teach at Winthrop University, and teaching in the computer science department gives me that little bit of engineering
That's
thoughts,
cool.
and I got to play with stuff a little bit as well, and
Mm-hmm.
keep fresh with the ideas and the new things that are coming up, because I'm teaching the next generation of computer scientists out there. So I've got to stay on top of that as well. I can't give them old stuff and then I become the old guy.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome.
So I think there's
Yeah,
ways
and
you can kind of do both. You just gotta be
mhm.
creative with it.
Yeah, and I know like my engineering manager, I love using him as an example because he's a really good manager, and he specifically doesn't code at work because he doesn't want to be on the critical path of anything,
Mm-hmm.
but he writes video games on the side for fun as a hobby. And it's
That
like
is awesome.
he really likes video games, he really likes coding, so it's like, oh, I'm just going to take this video game and remix it into a new video game, and he gets to like play with Unity and with weird algorithms that we're never going to get exposed to in the business world, and he has fun. um like
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I think it's a great way to do it. Plus, it's a nice little side,
mhm.
hobby to help him be able to, not go stale and not be able to lose
Yeah,
track of the latest and greatest things.
exactly. And if he gets lucky, maybe he's the next notch, who knows.
It's always a possibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you see a lot when you're talking to other senior engineers, or you're at conferences or something like that, where people feel like they are getting those golden handcuffs, where they feel like,
Mhm.
my company offered me a lot of equity, so I can't like leave to go somewhere else, but I'm doing the same thing over and over again. I'm getting burned out.
Yeah.
And if so, how do you advise people when they get in that situation?
So the best thing you said there is doing the same thing over and over. I think that's the biggest trap you can fall into as a software engineer, or as anything really, is you have to keep asking yourself, are you getting 5 years of experience, or are you getting 1 year of experience 5 times?
Right.
And as soon as you get into that repetitive stuff, honestly, the best advice is to just leave and take the hit. Because the way I like to think about it is like a hill climbing algorithm. This is from machine learning. The idea is that you find the tallest hill you can see, you climb to the top, and that's your improvement. That's how much you're getting better. That's how much the company is improving, or whatever. And you climb as long as it's steep. But then, as it starts leveling off, as you're starting to reach the top of the hill, you're in a local maximum. So what you have to do when you're in a local maximum is look around you and find the next tallest hill that you can see. The benefit here is that because you have that experience, because you've seen more things, etc., you now have a higher vantage point that you did a couple of years ago, and you can see more hills in the distance. You can see things that you
Mm-hmm.
weren't able to see when you were at the bottom of the hill. So you get to the top of the hill or near the top, you look around, and the scariest part is that getting to the next tallest hill usually involves going downhill first for a little bit. And that's the scary part for most people. For not for most people, for everyone, that's the scary part, is that to get to a better global maximum, you have to give up your local maximum first and take the hit. Now, the nice thing in the software industry is that you are probably overestimating how tall your current hill is. And it's very common to get bigger, better golden handcuffs when you switch jobs. Like, I think typically, especially in today's market, you would probably expect to get a 20 to 30% pay raise from changing jobs. And then you can also finagle with signing bonuses and stuff like that to cover any pain of moving. And yeah, it's like companies love the golden handcuffs, and they love dangling, especially with equity. They love to dangle that in front of you and say, if you stay just a few more years, you're going to have this much more equity. But you shouldn't really think about it that way. You should think about it more from the sunk cost fallacy. It's like, it's not yours yet. You still have to vest that stuff. So since it's not yours yet, you don't have it. So you shouldn't really think about it as something that is already yours. I forget what the fallacy is called, but when we think we have something, we automatically value it as more than before we have it. So like, if you buy a mug for, I think the study was that you buy a coffee mug for $1, and then when somebody asks you, hey, would you sell that coffee mug for $1, and you're back to square zero, most people say, no, this coffee mug is worth at least $2. But it's like, it's the same coffee mug. Actually, it's a worse coffee mug because it's used now. So I think you should, it's like, it's hard to think that way, but it really helps to see, hey, if I change jobs or if I just go somewhere else, the worst that can happen is that I'm in the same situation as I am now. And like things that you don't actually have yet, especially with vesting, this is important. You should probably not really take them into account too much in your decision.
Yeah. No, I agree with you 100% on pretty much all that you're saying, because you never know, like, what are you giving up? You're giving up potentially, like, I know a lot of those vesting programs are like 3 years. You get like 30% the first year, 30% the next year, and then 40% that last year if you stay for a 3-year period. You're giving up 3 years of your life, 3 years of growth, 3 years of boredom, 3 years of who knows what. And if you take anybody in tech, in any realm of tech, whether it's software engineering, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's cybersecurity, and you give them 3 years of not being able to grow and learn, they're going to be further behind than, it's so difficult to catch up.
Yeah. And then especially with big companies, it's very easy. It looks great on your resume, but it's very easy to get sucked into some boring subpart of a subpart of a subpart of a system that nobody will ever have heard about. So that's why I don't really work with big companies, but I've heard a lot of people talk about this concept of rest and vest, and it's the way software engineers go to retire at like Google's and Facebook's and things like that. Where it's like, you find a cushy